Amelia is a counselor here in town at Napa Valley Counseling Center, and she has her own personal story of loss, and so she's going to speak to us. And I just wanted you to know she is going to be kind of our counselor voice today, but I also wanted you to know that she has walked through this. She has experienced loss, and so we just wanted to kind of talk about this. How do you handle the subject with your kids, and how do you explain to them? How do you answer questions? How do you walk through it yourself kind of simultaneously? And so I know the first thing that we wanted to talk about is there are different levels of grief. There are different levels of loss. And talk to us about that just a little bit.
I think for the purpose of this conversation today, we're going to be talking specifically about death. So death of a child, death of a sibling, death of a parent or grandparent, family friend, that kind of thing. Definitely in this like COVID era, we have all experienced disappointment and loss to some degree or another. And I think that's been a pretty universal experience that we've all had. I think Carrie's actually going to touch on that a little bit later on, which is entirely valid and important to discuss. But just for the conversation today, we're going to keep it specifically about death and dying.
Yeah, and there's also a tendency to kind of compare levels of grief. Like my loss was worse than your loss. And so that's something that we don't want to do, that we want to be careful of.
I think one of the reasons we do that is because grief and death is so incredibly personal. The way, no two losses, while on the outside may look similar, we've both lost a child. The way you process that, the way you handle that, the way you learn to live after that is incredibly personal. And so when it kind of gets lumped together, that can be disrespectful or a lot of hurt feelings. There's just a lot of emotion around it. But I think one thing I see more of, both personally within myself, but also just professionally speaking, minimizing, a lot of grief minimizing. Oh, it was just this. And you can fill in the blank with, oh, it was just whatever. But that just hurts my heart when I see that, because it's not just, it is that. And so, if you really want to deal with your grief and process through that, both for yourself and for your children, calling it what it is, I think, is the first step.
Yeah, it is your pain, and so we don't have to compare that to what other people are experiencing. So let's talk a little bit about how do we talk to our kids about this subject of varying ages, varying levels of understanding.
Sure. Just off the top of my head, kind of thinking about having a conversation with your child about death. Them coming to you, you see them struggling behaviorally, thinking maybe this is related to. There's a variety of techniques, and so if you were to go to a counselor's office, especially with a young child, they would likely do some version of play therapy. And you can Google like play therapy techniques and you can execute that yourself, not on the level maybe that a professional would, but just in play with your own child. And so that looks a lot like getting, dolls or animals or dinosaurs, it would have been in my house, and just having intentional conversation around that, asking leading questions, just to kind of get conversation going in kind of when your guard is down setting. Another thing I'll kind of tell you, there's this website, National Alliance for Children's Grief, and on that is just a wealth of information and knowledge. And one of the things I have found most helpful there are scripts. They have literal scripts that you can kind of read through, imagine having these conversations with your children, and it will help you kind of have a guided conversation with your child then. That can be something that when you don't really know what to say, can kind of give you some ideas and springboard, and then you can certainly personalize it to your situation. Another thing I would encourage you to think about is that over time, your children will process this grief and almost sort of reprocess it as life happens. And so if you're talking with your young child about a death, and then, that child later on is in middle school or in high school or on their wedding day, like, it's going to come up in different ways throughout their life, typically around milestones. And so, not that really anybody would be naive as to think we're going to talk about this once and not again, but expect it to come, especially at milestone or sort of pivotal points throughout their lives.
Yeah, one of the things that we talked about when we were discussing this is just normalizing talking about it. Because I think that that's one thing that sometimes we avoid talking about it because it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
But normalizing talking about our feelings just on a day-to-day basis, not even waiting for those milestones, waiting for the big moments, because that just makes it bigger and harder. But to just normalize talking about and expressing your own feelings.
You mentioning that kind of reminds me too, in thinking specifically about talking to younger children, 2, 3, 4 years old, using clear language. I think a lot of times we shy away from saying died or death. We gloss over it, whether for our own sake or for the sake of the child, thinking that they are unable to handle that level of sadness or grief. But often we underestimate them. We underestimate the degree to which this has impacted them. We underestimate how much they actually know about what's going on. And so I think, and this will take some practice yourself, but just what is the narrative around this going to be in our family? And that gets written over time, but using words like died and death and being clear about it. When we say loss to a child, I lost my toy, I lost my blanket, my levy, like there's an expectation of being found.
Yes,
Mm-hmm,
yes,
exactly.
I see that.
And so saying, your brother has died is hard to say, but it is clear, and it's important that you can be as clear and trustworthy as possible.
Yeah, there's a quote by Brene Brown, who I do not endorse all of her everything. Hear that. Yeah. But she does have some good quotes.
She really does.
And one of them says, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. And for me, I tend to think unclear is softer and it's more gentle and that's kind, when really it's just confusing.
It's putting a filter over your words. It's blurring out the
that's
difficult,
a great,
sharp edges.
Yeah.
And for a child who has no idea what's going on, that's difficult.
Okay, so let's talk about that in terms of one of the things that we talked about was not undersharing, which is kind of what you're talking about, but also not oversharing, especially projecting your own feelings onto your kids. So talk about that and what that means.
I will say I think most of us would have a tendency to undershare for a lot of the reasons that we just named. And so if you are considering like how much do I share, or how often do we talk about it, I would just sort of keep in the back of my mind, we generally have a tendency to undershare, especially with a child. We don't want to put it on them. And so kind of lean into that and prepare yourself for that. Where it might turn from undersharing to oversharing is, I like the way you said, projecting your own feelings. If your child is experiencing a loss, it's very likely that you yourself are also. Rarely would a child be experiencing grief and loss separate from you, especially a young child, that you have similar lives. And so an awareness that, and even a conversation with your children too, like, I don't have all the answers and I don't have it together, and these are my tears and you are here with me and we're doing this together. I don't know it all. You might think that that is gonna, send a message to your child that I'm not safe because my mom's not in control. But really it's showing them, it's an opportunity to show them, like, death is a part of life. You are experiencing death at an age that I had hoped you wouldn't. But this is the situation that we are in, and this is what it looks like. This is what grief looks like.
Yeah. Well, and what an opportunity, again, to point our kids to somebody bigger than ourselves. And to say, no, I don't understand, but I know that God does. I know that He's in control. And we live in a broken world. We won't forever, which is a great segue to heaven, too. And
yes.
Let's talk about that. How do you talk to your kids from a biblical and spiritual point of view about death and heaven, and what is some advice that you have there?
Just personally speaking from our own experience, there have been blessings of my son Henry's death that I never would have foreseen coming. And one of the most tangible ones is an opportunity to talk to my kids about heaven and God, who is very real, not abstract, not separate, not uninvolved, but present every day. And so when we talk about heaven, often it is where Henry is and where Jesus is, and like literal pictures of heaven. I'll kind of go ahead and show you. There's this book, Heaven is for Real. There's a like an adult version of it, and it's the story of Colton Burpo, who was in a coma, and while he was there had this experience of heaven, and he goes and meets a variety of people, a deceased grandfather, I believe, and their family had a miscarriage. I think it was the sister. Anyway, he just has all these experiences, and when he comes out of his coma, he like tells his family, like, this is what happened, and saying things that they didn't know that he even knew about or anything like that. And one of the things I love about this book, his amazing experience for sure, but it is full of scripture references. So like when you're talking to your kids about pearly gates and golden streets, like it's in here. Like when you're painting a literal picture of all the animals living in harmony, and there's not a sun because Jesus is the light, and it's like all of that is here. So you've got like your story, and it is really accessible to all ages. So it's got like kind of a bold title of the page, and you could read that to a 2-year-old, and then a 4 or 5-year-old could kind of read a little bit more about Colton's experience, and then on each page there is a scripture reference talking about the glory of God in heaven. So anyway, it's such a cool, tangible way to really get to talk to your kids about what heaven looks like, who is there, why we want to be there, what is eternal life, who goes to heaven. I mean, that's the beginning of a salvation conversation at 2 or 3 years old.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about those conversations, as you were kind of saying, those different ages. I think about it as just layers. And like you were saying, you're going to continue to process that. And so you don't have to feel like, you have to lay all those layers at one time. You want to kind of lay a thin layer, and then you know that you're going to come back and you're going to lay more on top of that as they get older and older. So let's talk a little bit. You mentioned that when a child experiences grief, that you as a parent most likely are as well. So let's talk a little bit about how do you manage those things simultaneously?
Your own grief and that of your child. Yeah. I do kind of want to say, just as a real clear, oftentimes I get asked questions of, how do I know when it's time to go to counseling? Like, I don't know if it's because I'm a counselor, but I've been a recipient, like a participant of and a provider of, but everybody should go to counseling at some point. You just should. Like, life is very difficult. But I always will say it's when it's interfering with just your regular day-to-day life. And I think the same is true for your child. So a lot of these things that we're talking about, either references, and I think Carrie's printed a reference sheet for you. I'm going to give you a couple of titles of books, even some play therapy techniques and some scripts. All of that is stuff that can be done at home, just you and your child playing or talking with each other. Where you yourself are struggling to the degree to which either you cannot discuss it with your child, you see your child is acting out, and obviously most of the time with young children it's behavioral. Those are the instances where I'm like, okay, maybe get a professional involved, both for yourself and for your child. And I don't mean you can't have conversations like without crying. Like, absolutely cry and grieve. That's not the standard, but I'm saying like you are withdrawing from your child. You are distancing. You are guarding your heart from being hurt by the loss of them, potentially. Those are the kinds of flags, so to speak, that I would go, it might be a better choice for you yourself to have some counseling, and also for your child to begin to be able to process that stuff, because they are also experiencing it, and the helplessness when you can't help them because you are drowning in it.
Yeah.
All the freedom there to employ external resources.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, one thing that I want us to talk about is you were kind of explaining to me the circles of grief, and how that structure works. And I think we have a visual to put up that I just want you to kind of explain and talk to us about, and how that works with a child and a parent too.
Yeah, this is something to kind of keep in mind when you are walking with a friend or loved one that has experienced a loss. Like, there's circles of grief is kind of the title of it, and the person in the middle is the one that's experienced the trauma. So this is the person that's very closest to, if it's a child, it's this person's parent. If it's a spouse, it's this person's husband or wife. It's the person who is the closest to the one who has died. And then as you go out from there, there are these concentric circles. So then it's your children, it's your close friends, it's your extended family, it's your neighbors, and those go out from there. The thing to keep in mind about that, and the thing I really like about this graphic in particular, is everybody is affected by loss to some degree, but being mindful of where you are in that compared to a relative to another person, and are you pouring comfort in, or are you sort of dumping on? And so these arrows where it talks about, the further out you are, ensure that if you're talking to somebody in an inner circle, you are only providing comfort. You are not having any expectation of being comforted. And then, the closer you are to the center, the more sort of permission that you have to dump out and to unload. Now, the thing that gets tricky with childhood grief, though, is, as I mentioned before, you're both in there together. And that's where I just kind of go, you're the parent. Like, they're going to dump on you. And that's to be expected. If you find that you're resentful of that, if you find that you can't handle the weight of that, that's where a counselor could really come in and help kind of mitigate the amount of dumping on that you're feeling. And if you are in one of those kind of middle rings there, just be aware of the relationship to kind of the person in the center.
I love that. It's so helpful to think about, even when you're just in a difficult situation, maybe not even in a death, but just when somebody's in a difficult situation, like, this is going to come back to my mind, and I'm going to say, okay, I need to only pour comfort in. I don't need to share how I'm feeling with somebody who's in one of those inner circles. So I think that's really good. So we do have a resource page printed for you at the back podium, just a little half sheet that has some resources that I knew about, some resources that Amelia gave to me. But as we kind of wrap up, and I think the grief circles is really helpful as a friend of someone who's experiencing loss. But how else would you advise us to be a friend to someone who's experienced loss?
I think that Lindsay did a really good job answering that question a couple of weeks ago when she spoke. And again, that's where I come back to. Grief is such a personal experience that maybe what I would have found helpful, maybe she wouldn't, or vice versa. And so I think part of that is what lends to people going, I don't know what to say. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to be insensitive. I don't want to cause further hurt or grief. And so then they say nothing. And I just 10 times out of 10 would encourage you to say something. You stepping out to help a friend who is in grief is very uncomfortable. That person is living that uncomfortable conversation every single minute of every single day. You being willing to step into that discomfort means more than I think I could communicate to anybody. And that is remembered. That is something that, you take with you, and that kindness, because you being the person in grief knows that it's hard for them to come to you and say something to you. And so always, always say something, whether it is a card or, stopping by their house, or a text. I think Lindsay referenced putting dates on your calendar and a reminder to send a text at significant dates. But, and something I would also say to kind of ease any discomfort of unsure, am I going to say the wrong thing? If it is not received well, and sometimes it's obvious that what you've said is hurtful unintentionally, but if it is not received well, have grace for yourself and know that with time, a lot of those messages get eased. A lot of that pain that you feel like maybe you're the cause of or that you've contributed to in some way, that kind of gets blurred over time. And more times than not, you remember the ones that were brave enough to step into and say something. I mean, I'll say Carrie Helmick, who I don't really know very well, but just have known through church. After Henry died, it was probably 4 months later, and I only kind of knew her just in similar circles. And we were at the pool with our kids, and, oh, hi, how's it going? And in passing, and that was it. And she came back over to me, and she was like, I know we don't know each other very well, but I know your son Henry died. How are you doing, really? And I was just like, oh my gosh, like, that's incredible. I mean, that's just the kind of person she is. She is wonderful and so thoughtful. But gosh, that meant a lot to me. Like, she doesn't know me, and she like specifically got out of her comfort zone to say, I know, and I see you. How are you really? That meant a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that.
So, a couple other things before we go.
Yeah.
Locally, really good resource for children in grief is called the Good Morning Center. It's at Arkansas Children's Hospital, and they run groups for children who are in grief, who have experienced loss and death. And one thing that's really important for young children especially is to know that they're not alone. They're not the only ones that have experienced something like this, and to sort of begin to make bonds with peers who are also in grief. And they can also connect you to counseling resources in our community, both for family and for the child as well. And then, like I mentioned, this book, This Heaven is for Real. There's a few others in terms of like for younger children. There's a book called The Goodbye Book, and there's another book called When Dinosaurs Die, A Guide to Understanding Death. And so that's really putting death and grief in terms of like a young, like preschool age. They're picture books. A few others that have been recommended that I actually haven't read myself, but through colleagues and peers that have found useful. Where Are You? A child's book about loss. The Fall of Freddie the Leaf, a story of life for all ages. Kind of walks through the life. It uses nature as sort of a parallel. Lifetimes, The Beautiful Way to Explain Death to Children. And Water Bugs and Dragonflies. Your leaders all have those references and those resources, so if you missed some of that and you're interested, I mean, that's something you could just check out at the library as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for your willingness to walk us through some of those things. If you have further questions on that, I'm here, Amelia's here. She has way more answers and wisdom on this than I do, but we can connect you to what you need. So please reach out. I hope that this has been helpful to you either directly or to you indirectly as you maybe walk alongside a friend.
I'll say too, just one more thing. If anybody like is experiencing any of this that we talked about, and you don't really want to like go the full like counseling and all that, please get in touch with Carrie, who can get you in touch with me, and we can have coffee and just visit. I mean, I would be so happy to be able to be available in any way that would be helpful if you feel like you want a middle of the road intervention.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate you.